Welcome, dear listeners, to a mystery steeped in silence, shadows, and the slow drip of fear. Tonight we arrive at an old estate where the wine cellar is colder than the stone walls that hold it, and quieter than the secrets locked inside. When a chilling crime occurs below ground, the strangest detail isn't the evidence left behind, it's what's missing, because the killer didn't just strike. The killer escaped without a sound. Hercule Poirot steps into a world of vintage bottles, hidden passages, whispered alibis, and a clue that only reveals itself to those who listen to silence. Settle in, relax, and let your little grey cells awaken, because in the silent wine cellar, someone planned the perfect disappearance. Chapter 1: The Door That Closed Without Sound. The wine cellar beneath Chateau Montreval was built for patience. Its stone walls were thick enough to keep out summer heat and winter cruelty alike, and the air within carried a constant chill that slowed time to a respectful crawl. Bottles rested in their racks like monks in silent prayer, dust settling on their shoulders year after year. Nothing hurried here. Nothing spoke unless disturbed. That was why the sound, or rather, the absence of it, was so unsettling. At precisely 11 minutes past 10, a scream echoed down the narrow stone staircase leading to the cellar. It was sharp, sudden, and utterly out of place among the aged bottles and quiet shadows. Moments later, lantern light flickered against the walls as guests rushed down from the dining room above, their footsteps clumsy and loud in a place that resented intrusion. They found Marcel Duval lying at the base of the central rack. He was on his back, one hand outstretched, fingers curled as though he had reached for something that had already been taken away. A shattered wine bottle lay beside him, dark liquid spreading slowly across the stone floor like a wound that refused to close. Marcel Duval was dead. Yet the most remarkable detail was not the body. It was the cellar door. It stood closed, not locked, not barred. Simply closed, and no one remembered hearing it shut. An invitation to silence. Hercule Poirot arrived at Chateau Montreval shortly after midnight, summoned by Inspector Japp, who looked distinctly displeased with both the cold and the situation. "I don't like cellars," Japp muttered as Poirot descended the steps beside him. "Too many places to hide, too many excuses." Poirot smiled faintly. "And yet, mon ami, this one offers very few." They reached the cellar floor. Poirot stopped immediately. He did not approach the body. He did not examine the bottle. He listened. The cellar breathed quietly around them. The thick stones swallowed sound greedily. Even Japp's boots seemed embarrassed by the noise they made. Poirot closed his eyes. "A silent room," Poirot murmured, "is rarely an innocent one." Japp frowned. "The door wasn't locked. Anyone could have left." Poirot opened his eyes. "Ah," he said gently. "But did they?" Poirot walked slowly to the door and opened it. The hinges made no sound. Japp stared. "Well, I'll be damned." Poirot nodded. "Well maintained, oiled regularly, a door designed not to announce movement." Poirot turned back toward the body. "Inspector," he said softly, "this killer did not escape by force." Poirot paused. "He escaped by silence." In the gathering above, the guests waited in the drawing room upstairs, pale-faced and restless. The fire burned low, casting nervous shadows on the walls. Glasses of untouched wine stood abandoned on side tables. Poirot surveyed them carefully. There were 6. Etienne Laurent, the estate owner, proud, anxious, and visibly shaken. Madame Céleste Laurent, his wife, composed, watchful, inscrutable. Henri Valois, a wine merchant with a keen eye and a sharper tongue. Lucien Moreau, the cellar master, quiet, deferential, observant. Isabelle Fournier, a guest and former associate of the deceased. Father Benoit, a visiting priest who had arrived earlier that evening. Poirot introduced himself politely and took a seat. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot said calmly, "I will ask you all the same question." He paused, letting the silence do its work. "Why was Marcel Duval in the cellar tonight?" Etienne Laurent answered first. "He wished to inspect a bottle for tomorrow's auction." Henri Valois scoffed. "He had no authority to do so alone." Lucien Moreau spoke softly. "Monsieur Duval knew the cellar well." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Knew it well," Poirot repeated. "Then he knew the rules." Lucien nodded. "Yes, monsieur." Poirot leaned back slightly. "And yet," Poirot said, "someone broke one." The timeline that doesn't speak. Inspector Japp outlined the sequence. Dinner had ended at 10 o'clock. Coffee was served in the drawing room. Marcel Duval excused himself shortly after, stating he wished to select a bottle personally. At 10:11, Isabelle Fournier screamed from the cellar stairs. No one recalled hearing footsteps returning. No one recalled hearing the cellar door. Poirot tapped his fingers lightly together. "A killer who leaves no sound," Poirot said softly, "must rely on predictability." Poirot turned to Lucien Moreau. "You maintain the cellar?" "Yes, monsieur." "You oil the hinges?" "Yes." "You know which racks creak?" "Yes." Poirot smiled faintly. "And which do not?" Lucien swallowed. Poirot raised a hand gently. "I accuse no one," Poirot said. "Not yet." The bottle that should not be broken, Poirot finally knelt near the body. The bottle was old, valuable, carefully stored, and deliberately shattered. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "this bottle was not dropped." Japp frowned. "You're sure?" Poirot nodded. The glass broke outward. It was used. Poirot examined Marcel Duval's hand. "There are no defensive wounds," Poirot continued. "No struggle." Poirot stood. This was not a fight. He glanced toward the rack. It was a moment. The door. Again Poirot returned to the cellar door once more. He opened it, closed it, listened. Nothing. Poirot turned to Japp. "Inspector," he said, "how many people came down the stairs after the scream?" "All of them." Poirot nodded. "And yet," he said softly, "the killer did not pass them." Japp's brow furrowed. "Unless," Poirot raised a finger. "Unless," Poirot said, "the killer never went up the stairs at all." Silence filled the cellar. Poirot looked slowly around the racks, the shadows between them, the dark corners where stone met stone. "A wine cellar," Poirot murmured, "is built to preserve and to conceal." He straightened. "And tonight," Poirot said calmly, "someone escaped not by running, but by remaining unseen." The cellar had kept its secret well, but Poirot knew silence always speaks to those who listen long enough. Chapter 2. Footsteps that never returned. Morning settled reluctantly over Chateau Montreval. The estate looked unchanged beneath the pale light, its vineyards stretching calmly into the distance, the stone walls holding centuries of quiet dignity. Yet inside the atmosphere had shifted. Servants moved more cautiously, doors were closed with exaggerated care. Even voices seemed reluctant to rise above a murmur, as though sound itself had become suspect. Hercule Poirot welcomed this restraint. Discomfort, he knew, forced memory to sharpen. Inspector Japp joined Poirot in the breakfast room, where untouched coffee had grown cold. "No one admits going near the cellar after dinner," Japp said. "They all swear they stayed upstairs." Poirot nodded. "Naturally." Japp frowned. "You sound unconvinced." Poirot smiled faintly. "I am unconvinced that they are lying in the way they believe." Poirot rose and walked toward the cellar stairs once more. The staircase that betrays movement. The cellar staircase was narrow, steep, and old. Its stone steps bore the smooth polish of generations of use. Poirot descended slowly, counting under his breath. "Listen, Inspector," Poirot said softly. Japp frowned. "Listen to what?" Poirot stepped deliberately on the fourth stair. It creaked. Poirot stepped on the sixth. It groaned faintly. Poirot stepped on the ninth. Silence. Poirot smiled. "Not all steps speak," Poirot said, "but enough of them do." Poirot turned. "When 6 people run down these stairs together," he continued, "the stairs protest." Japp nodded. "And someone coming up would have been heard." Poirot raised a finger. "Unless," he said gently, "they did not use the stairs at all." Access is not the same as opportunity. Back upstairs, Poirot asked the guests to gather once more, not for accusation, but clarification. "Mesdames et messieurs," Poirot said calmly, "we will speak not of guilt, but of movement." He turned to Lucien Moreau, the cellar master. "You know the cellar better than anyone." "Yes, monsieur. You know every rack, every passage, every draught of air." Lucien hesitated. "Yes." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Tell me," Poirot said softly, "are there any other exits from the cellar?" The room held its breath. Lucien swallowed. "There is," A service passage. Japp stiffened. You didn't mention that. Lucien lowered his eyes. It is old, rarely used. Poirot nodded. Old passages are the favorites of killers. The passage no one mentions, Lucien led them down again, lantern in hand toward the far end of the cellar. Between two racks, partially concealed by crates, was a narrow stone doorway. It was camouflaged perfectly. Dust lay undisturbed on its surface. Poirot crouched. The dust, Poirot said softly, is intentional. Japp frowned. You think someone cleaned around it? Poirot nodded. Yes, but not recently. Poirot examined the latch. Oiled, he murmured, like the door. Poirot straightened. The killer did not discover this passage, Poirot said. He maintained it. A man who knows the cellar, Poirot turned back toward Lucien. You maintain the cellar, Poirot said gently. Lucien nodded. Yes. You oil hinges. Yes. You manage airflow. Yes. Poirot's eyes were kind but penetrating. And you know when footsteps can be avoided. Lucien's hands trembled. Japp stepped forward. Lucien, did you leave the cellar that way? Lucien shook his head violently. No, I swear it. Poirot raised a hand. I believe you, Poirot said softly. Lucien looked up, startled. This murder required confidence, Poirot continued, not fear. Lucien exhaled shakily. The first false shape of guilt suspicion settled quickly, as it always did. A cellar master, a hidden passage, a body among the racks. It looks like Lucien, Japp muttered later. Poirot shook his head. Too obvious, Poirot said, and too risky. Poirot walked alone through the racks, noting something subtle. One section of bottles had been disturbed, not broken, not missing, rearranged. Poirot frowned. This is not panic, he murmured. This is staging. At the victim's last decision, Poirot returned to Marcel Duval's body once more, the outstretched hand, the shattered bottle. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Inspector, Poirot said quietly. Marcel Duval did not stumble. Japp frowned. What makes you say that? Poirot gestured to the bottle. He was struck, Poirot said. Once, cleanly. Poirot paused. And by someone standing very close, Japp inhaled. So the killer was already in the cellar. Poirot nodded. Waiting, he said softly. Upstairs lees are loud. Later that morning, Poirot spoke privately with Isabelle Fournier. You screamed, Poirot said gently. Yes. You were the first to reach the cellar. Yes, Poirot tilted his head. And yet, he said, you did not hear the door close. She shook her head. No. Poirot nodded. That scream, Poirot said softly, announced the crime, but not the escape. The shape of the truth emerging, Poirot returned to the cellar alone. He closed the main door. Silence. He opened the service passage. A faint draught stirred his moustache. Poirot smiled faintly. The killer, Poirot murmured, did not run. He straightened. He walked away, calmly. And only one kind of person walks calmly after murder. Someone who believes the place itself will protect them. Poirot ascended the stairs slowly. The cellar had spoken again, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly enough. The killer had escaped through silence, and now that silence had a direction. Chapter 3. The man who knew the silence Chateau Montreval had always respected routine. That was its greatest strength, and now its greatest vulnerability. By the third morning after Marcel Duval's death, the estate had settled into a careful imitation of normalcy. Breakfast was served at the same hour. The cellar inventory was checked at the same time. Servants moved with the same efficiency they always had. Only one thing had changed. Everyone was listening. Hercule Poirot noticed this immediately as he took his place at the long breakfast table. Conversations faltered when he entered. Cups were lifted and set down more carefully than before. Even laughter, when it appeared, seemed rehearsed. Inspector Japp leaned toward him. They're watching each other now, Poirot nodded. As they should. Silence becomes suspicious once it is noticed. Poirot rose before the meal ended. "Inspector," he said quietly, "today we speak of knowledge. The cellar is not just a room." Poirot returned to the wine cellar alone. He moved slowly between the racks, trailing his fingers lightly along the dusty bottles. Some were untouched, their dust thick and even. Others had been brushed recently, just enough to leave faint streaks where hands had passed. Poirot stopped. One rack, close to the hidden service passage, showed a curious inconsistency. The dust was disturbed not at hand height, but lower, near the floor. Poirot crouched. "Interesting," he murmured. "Someone had knelt here recently, not hurriedly, not in panic, deliberately." Poirot straightened and glanced toward the passage entrance. The stone edges were worn smooth, not from age alone, but from repeated careful use. Whoever escaped through this passage did so confidently, without fear of stumbling or delay. "This was not discovery," Poirot said softly to the cellar walls. "This was familiarity." Lucien Moreau, under pressure. Lucien Moreau, the cellar master, was summoned to the tasting room shortly thereafter. He arrived pale but composed, hands folded tightly in front of him. "You have worked here many years," Poirot said gently. 23, Lucien replied. Poirot nodded appreciatively. "Then you know the cellar, as others know their own homes." "Yes, monsieur." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Tell me," he said calmly, "how often is the service passage used?" Lucien hesitated. "Rarely, only for deliveries, emergencies." Poirot smiled faintly. "And how often is it maintained?" Lucien swallowed. "I check it monthly." Poirot tilted his head. "Monthly?" "Yes." Poirot's eyes sharpened. "Then why?" Poirot asked softly. "Were the hinges oiled yesterday?" Lucien's face drained of color. I don't know," he stammered. Poirot raised a hand. "Calm yourself, I am not accusing." Lucien exhaled shakily. "But you see," Poirot continued, "someone cared deeply that the passage remained silent." Lucien nodded slowly. "Yes." Poirot leaned back. "And that person," Poirot said, "is not afraid of being heard." A voice from the past that afternoon. Poirot spoke with Etienne Laurent, the estate owner, in his study. "You inherited this place," Poirot said. "Yes, and with it, its traditions," Laurent nodded. "Montreval values discretion." Poirot smiled gently. "Discretion often becomes secrecy." Poirot gestured toward the cellar. "Who besides Lucien knows the cellar well?" Poirot asked. Laurent hesitated. "There is one other," he said finally. Poirot's moustache twitched. "Marcel Duval," Laurent continued. "He oversaw acquisitions years ago. He trained Lucien." Poirot nodded slowly. "And now," Poirot said softly, "someone trained by Marcel Duval used that knowledge against him." The victim who taught his killer Poirot returned once more to the cellar and stood where Marcel Duval had fallen. He examined the position carefully, the angle of the blow, the placement of the body, the direction Marcel's hand had reached. Poirot closed his eyes. "He recognized his attacker," Poirot murmured. There had been no struggle because there had been no fear, only surprise. The bottle had been swung not in rage, but in certainty by someone who knew Marcel would not resist. Isabelle Fournier's convenient scream. Poirot requested a private conversation with Isabelle Fournier. "You screamed," Poirot said gently. "Yes," she replied. "I found him." Poirot nodded. "You arrived quickly?" "Yes." Poirot tilted his head. "And yet," he said softly, "your scream came after the cellar door was closed." Isabelle's eyes widened. I didn't close it." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, but you arrived after someone else did." Poirot leaned back. "Your scream," Poirot continued, "did not interrupt the escape." Isabelle swallowed. "What are you suggesting?" Poirot replied calmly. "That you were not first." The first false shape takes form by evening. Suspicion had taken its first clear shape. Lucien Moreau, the cellar master, the man who knew every sound. Inspector Japp voiced what everyone else was thinking. "It points to Lucien," he said quietly. Poirot shook his head. Lucien knows silence, Poirot said, but he does not command it. Japp frowned. What's the difference? Poirot replied softly. Lucien avoids noise. The killer controls it, Poirot stood. The killer is someone who expects the cellar to obey. A subtle test. That night, Poirot conducted a small experiment. Without announcing it, he asked a servant to open the service passage door at a specific hour. Poirot waited in the corridor. Within minutes, footsteps approached. Not hurried, not hesitant, measured. Poirot did not turn. He listened. The footsteps stopped. Then silence. Someone had realized the door was open. Someone who knew it should not be. Poirot smiled faintly. The fish has felt the net, he murmured. The direction of escape. By the end of the day, Poirot's understanding had sharpened. The killer did not flee upstairs, did not panic, did not improvise. The killer moved downward into familiarity, and more importantly, the killer returned later to ensure silence remained intact. Only someone who believed the cellar belonged to them would do that. Poirot returned to his room and made a single note in his pocketbook. The murderer escaped because the cellar trusted him. The truth was no longer hidden. It was merely waiting to be spoken aloud. Chapter 4. The silence that obeyed someone. Chateau Montreval had begun to betray itself, not through words, nor through obvious mistakes, but through the smallest, most telling change of all: obedience. Doors were closed carefully. Servants waited for permission they once assumed. The cellar, once a neutral space of preservation, now felt like a place that responded to authority rather than routine. Hercule Poirot sensed it the moment he descended the cellar steps that morning. The air was colder than before, not in temperature, but in temperament. Poirot paused on the landing, listening. The silence here was no longer passive, it was expectant. "Inspector," Poirot said softly as Japp joined him. "Have you noticed?" Japp frowned. "Noticed what?" Poirot gestured vaguely around them. "This place is waiting." Lucien Moreau, the convenient shape of guilt. Lucien Moreau had become restless. He avoided the cellar unless absolutely necessary. When he did enter, his movements were cautious, his eyes darting not with guilt but with fear. Poirot watched him carefully from a distance, noting the difference. Guilty men rushed, frightened men hesitated. Poirot called Lucien aside near the tasting room. "You are uncomfortable here now," Poirot observed gently. Lucien nodded. "Everyone looks at me." Poirot smiled faintly. "That is the burden of being the obvious one." Lucien looked up sharply. "You don't believe it was me?" Poirot met his gaze. "No," Poirot said calmly. "Because you fear the cellar." Lucien swallowed. "And the killer?" Poirot replied softly. "The killer feels at home." It's the estate that has two masters. Poirot requested a private conversation with Etienne Laurent, the estate owner. They met in the study, sunlight filtering through tall windows onto polished wood and old ledgers. "Montreval runs smoothly," Poirot remarked. Laurent nodded. "It always has." Poirot tilted his head. "Smoothness," Poirot said, "requires clear authority." Laurent hesitated. Poirot continued gently. "You own the estate, but who manages its rhythms?" Laurent exhaled slowly. "There is one person," he admitted, "who ensures nothing is disturbed." Poirot's moustache twitched. "And who is that?" Poirot asked. Laurent hesitated only a second too long. "Henri Valois," he said finally. Henri Valois, the man who should not be here. Henri Valois was not staff. He was not family. He was something far more dangerous. He was entitled. As a wine merchant with long-standing ties to Chateau Montreval, Valois moved through the estate with an ease that was neither earned nor questioned. He knew the vintages, the routes, the schedules, and more importantly, he knew when silence was expected. Poirot found him in the courtyard, examining a crate with idle interest. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Valois said cheerfully. "Enjoying our hospitality?" Poirot smiled politely. "I am enjoying your confidence," Poirot replied. Valois laughed. "Confidence is required in my business?" Poirot nodded. "As is discretion." Valois' smile faltered for the briefest moment. The cellar test. That afternoon, Poirot conducted a deliberate test. He asked a servant, in Valois' presence, to leave the service passage door slightly ajar. Poirot then excused himself. He did not go far. From the corridor, he listened. Minutes passed. Then, soft, deliberate footsteps. Not hurried, not startled. Someone had noticed. Poirot stepped into view just as Henri Valois reached the passage door. Valois froze. "Oh," he said lightly, "I thought I heard a draft." Poirot inclined his head. "Of course," Poirot said calmly. "Drafts are troublesome things." Valois laughed too quickly and stepped away. Poirot did not follow. He had learned enough. The truth about Marcel Duval. That evening, Poirot studied Marcel Duval's background more carefully. Duval had once trained cellar masters. He had overseen acquisitions. He had also blocked certain deals. Henri Valois' deals. Inspector Japp brought the final piece. "Valois lost a major contract last year," Japp said. "Duval vetoed it." Poirot nodded slowly. "Then Marcel Duval did not just die in the cellar," Poirot said. "He died because he stood in the way." Why the door closed without sound, Poirot returned to the cellar alone that night. He closed the main door, listened, silence. He opened the service passage, listened, a faint draft. Poirot smiled faintly. "The killer," Poirot murmured, "did not escape through secrecy alone." He straightened. "He escaped because the cellar obeyed him. Someone who had access without suspicion, knowledge without fear, authority without title. Henri Valois fit too well." The killer who did not run, Poirot wrote in his notebook that night. The murderer did not flee the cellar. He departed as one leaves his own home. The final shape of the truth was forming, not yet sharp enough to cut, but heavy enough to fall. The silent wine cellar had chosen its master, and Poirot was ready to make it speak. Chapter 5. A man who never needed permission. Henri Valois did not look like a man under suspicion. That, Hercule Poirot observed, was precisely the problem. On the morning after Poirot's quiet encounter near the service passage, Valois moved through Chateau Montreval with his usual assurance, greeting servants by name, commenting on vintages, offering unsolicited advice with the easy authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. No one stopped him, no one questioned him, and most importantly, no one listened when he passed. Silence followed Valois the way respect follows power. Poirot watched from a distance as Valois examined a shipment of bottles in the courtyard, his hands confident, practiced, proprietary. "He behaves," Poirot murmured to Inspector Japp, "as though the estate owes him cooperation." Japp nodded. "He's been doing business here for years." Poirot smiled faintly. "Long enough to forget the difference between guest and owner." The nature of invisible authority. Poirot requested Valois' company for a walk through the vineyards. It was not an interrogation. It was an invitation. Valois accepted with enthusiasm. "Fresh air clears the mind," Valois said cheerfully as they strolled between the neat rows of vines, "especially after unpleasantness." Poirot nodded. "Unpleasantness reveals character," Valois laughed. "You investigators always look for monsters. Sometimes it's just business." Poirot stopped. "Business," Poirot said gently, "is one of the most efficient motives." Valois raised an eyebrow. "You suggest commerce kills?" Poirot replied softly. "I suggest entitlement does." They continued walking. "You were close to Marcel Duval," Poirot said conversationally. Valois shrugged. "Professionally?" Poirot tilted his head. "He trained the cellar masters." "Yes, and he vetoed certain acquisitions." Valois' stride shortened slightly. "Conservative man," Valois said lightly. "Outdated." Poirot nodded. "Outdated men often obstruct ambitious ones." Valois smiled thinly. "Ambition keeps estates alive." Poirot stopped again. "Ambition," Poirot said calmly, "also resents refusal." Valois looked away toward the vines. "Duval cost me a great deal of money." Poirot nodded. "And position." Valois turned sharply. "What position?" Poirot met his gaze. "The one you already occupied," Poirot said softly. "Unofficially." All the cellar knows him. Later that day, Poirot returned to the wine cellar with Inspector Japp. They stood near the service passage. "Notice something, Inspector?" Poirot asked. Japp frowned. "What?" Poirot gestured subtly. "There is no hesitation here," Poirot said. "No uncertainty." Poirot walked confidently through the passage, his steps sure. "The killer walked like this," Poirot continued. "Not searching, not adjusting." Poirot stopped at a narrow alcove. "This," Poirot said, "is where Marcel Duval was approached." Japp examined the stone. "How do you know?" Poirot pointed. "The dust is disturbed at shoulder height," Poirot explained. Someone leaned casually. Japp frowned. "Casually?" Poirot nodded. "Only someone who belonged here would lean." The bottle, as a message, the shattered bottle had not been chosen at random. Poirot confirmed this after reviewing the cellar records. It was one of the bottles Marcel Duval had removed from Valois' proposed shipment. "This was not convenience," Poirot said quietly. "This was commentary." Japp's eyes widened. "You think Valois wanted Duval to know why?" Poirot nodded. "He did not kill in anger," Poirot said. "He killed in correction." The quiet returned. That evening Poirot waited. He did not announce his presence. He did not set traps. He listened. Near midnight, soft footsteps approached the cellar. Poirot stood in shadow as Henri Valois entered, lantern in hand. Valois moved confidently, checking the service passage, inspecting the hinges, adjusting a crate that concealed the entrance. He did not startle when Poirot spoke. "You return," Poirot said softly, "to ensure silence." Valois sighed. "You see too much." Poirot stepped into the light. "You returned," Poirot continued, "because you could not bear disorder." Valois smiled faintly. "I like things done properly," Poirot nodded. "Including murder?" Valois laughed quietly. "You have no proof," Poirot smiled. "Not yet," Poirot said, "but I have your habits." The trap begins. The next morning, Poirot made a deliberate announcement. He informed the household that the service passage would be sealed temporarily for inspection. Valois reacted instantly. "That's unnecessary," he said sharply. "It's part of the airflow system." Poirot inclined his head. "So you know." Valois caught himself too late. Poirot smiled faintly. "Do not worry," Poirot said gently. "It is only temporary." Valois' confidence did not return. In The Killer Who Believed in Silence, that afternoon, Poirot spoke privately with Lucien Moreau. "You were never the killer," Poirot said calmly. Lucien exhaled shakily. "Then why was I afraid?" Poirot replied softly. "Because the killer wanted you to be." Poirot straightened. "Fear," Poirot said, "is the best disguise." A final note before the net tightens, Poirot wrote that evening. The murderer did not seek escape. He expected accommodation. Henri Valois had walked through Chateau Montreval for years, as though it belonged to him. He had learned its silences, its obediences, its permissions, and now Poirot intended to remove them. Chapter 6. The confession that came too easily at Chateau Montreval. Relief arrived too quickly. That was how Hercule Poirot knew it was false. The morning after the announcement that the service passage would be sealed, the estate breathed differently. Shoulders relaxed, voices rose just a little, servants moved with the cautious optimism of people who believed the worst had passed. Poirot observed this shift with concern. True endings never arrived gently. Inspector Japp found him in the courtyard, studying the gravel paths as though they might rearrange themselves. "You'll like this," Japp said. "We have a confession." Poirot did not smile. "From whom?" he asked quietly. Japp hesitated. "Lucien Moreau." Poirot closed his eyes briefly. "Of course," he murmured. A man who volunteers for guilt. Lucien sat in the small office near the cellar stairs, his hands folded tightly, knuckles pale with strain. He looked exhausted, more drained than frightened. "I did it," Lucien said hoarsely as Poirot entered. "I struck Marcel Duval. I panicked. I used the passage." Inspector Japp leaned forward. "You're sure?" Lucien nodded quickly. "Yes, I couldn't bear the pressure anymore." Poirot sat opposite him. "Lucien," Poirot said gently, Tell me how you felt when you returned to the cellar after the guests arrived. Lucien hesitated. I don't remember clearly. Poirot nodded. And the bottle, Poirot continued softly. Why that one? Lucien swallowed. It was nearby. Poirot shook his head gently. No, Poirot said. That bottle was chosen. Lucien's shoulders sagged. I just wanted to stop, he whispered. Poirot leaned forward. And someone, Poirot said calmly, told you that it would. Lucien looked up sharply. Poirot continued. Someone told you that confessing would protect the estate, protect the Lawrence, end the investigation. Lucien's eyes filled with tears. Yes, he whispered. Monsieur Valois said it was best. Poirot nodded slowly. The shape of manipulation. Outside, Inspector Japp paced angrily. He coached him, Japp muttered. Used him as a shield. Poirot nodded. A predictable move. Japp frowned. Predictable? Poirot smiled faintly. When control begins to slip, Poirot said, the manipulator offers sacrifice. Ken, the confession is rejected. Poirot returned to Lucien. Lucien, he said gently, this confession will not be accepted. Lucien stared. But Poirot raised a hand. You are afraid, Poirot said. But you are not the killer. Lucien broke down completely. Poirot stood. Fear, Poirot said softly, is not evidence. Henri Valois reacts. Henri Valois reacted badly to the news. You're making a mistake, he said sharply when Poirot informed him the confession was void. Lucien admitted it. Poirot inclined his head. Too neatly, Valois scoffed. You prefer theatrics, Poirot smiled faintly. No, Poirot replied. I prefer truth. Valois' composure cracked just slightly. Poirot pressed on. Lucien does not walk like a man who commands silence, Poirot said. You do. Valois' eyes hardened. You have nothing, Poirot nodded calmly. Not yet. The public trap is announced that afternoon. Poirot made his move. He requested that everyone who had been present on the night of Marcel Duval's death gather once more, this time in the cellar itself. The reaction was immediate. In the cellar, Isabelle Fournier whispered. Yes, Poirot replied, where truth feels most uncomfortable. Henri Valois objected sharply. That's unnecessary. Poirot met his gaze. On the contrary, Poirot said softly, it is inevitable. Killer who cannot resist order. As preparations were made, Poirot watched Valois carefully. Valois checked the passage repeatedly, adjusted crates, asked questions he should not need to ask. Poirot noted every movement. The killer, Poirot murmured to Japp, cannot tolerate uncertainty. Lucien is released that evening. Lucien was officially cleared. The relief was immediate and revealing. Valois' confidence did not return. Instead, it sharpened into calculation. Poirot knew that look. The look of a man deciding whether to flee or to correct one last imperfection. Chapter 7. When the cellar spoke aloud, the wine cellar of Chateau Montreval had never hosted an audience. It was a place of storage, of patience, of things meant to mature unseen. And yet, on this night, lanterns lined the stone walls, their flickering light exposing corners that had lived comfortably in shadow for decades. Everyone had been summoned, not upstairs, not by the fire, but here, where Marcel Duval had died and where silence had done the killer's work. Hercule Poirot stood near the central rack, hands folded, his expression calm. Inspector Japp remained close to the staircase, notebook ready. The guests and staff gathered in an uneasy semicircle, coats drawn tight against the cellar's cold. Henri Valois arrived last. He descended the steps with practiced ease, lantern held confidently, as though the cellar were a familiar extension of himself. Poirot noticed how his eyes flicked instantly toward the service passage, checking, calculating. Poirot smiled faintly. The trap had already tightened. Recreating the night, mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began gently. We are not here to accuse. Several faces relaxed. Poirot let the moment breathe. We are here, he continued, to remember correctly. Poirot gestured to the spot where Marcel Duval had fallen. On the night of the murder, Marcel Duval entered this cellar alone, Poirot said. He believed he was safe, Henri Valois scoffed softly. Anyone could have followed him. Poirot nodded. Yes, anyone. Poirot turned toward Lucien Moreau. You were here earlier that evening. Yes. You left before Marcel arrived. Yes, Poirot nodded. And after Marcel arrived, someone was already waiting. The cellar seemed to draw in its breath. The moment of contact, Poirot walked slowly to the rack where the shattered bottle had been found. This bottle, Poirot said, was not random. He turned the lantern so the label fragments caught the light. It was one Marcel Duval had personally rejected from Monsieur Valois' shipment. Valois stiffened. Poirot continued calmly. This was not rage, Poirot said. It was message. Poirot stepped back. The killer approached Marcel calmly. Poirot continued. No struggle, no fear, because Marcel recognized him. Poirot paused deliberately. He trusted him. Isabelle Fournier gasped softly. The silent exit. Poirot turned toward the cellar door. After the blow, Poirot said, the killer did not run upstairs. Poirot gestured toward the staircase. You all came down these steps after the scream, Poirot said. Loudly. Poirot smiled faintly. And yet, the killer was not among you. Poirot turned slowly toward the service passage. He left through here. Valois laughed sharply. That passage is hardly secret. Poirot inclined his head. No, but it is selective. Poirot stepped closer. Only someone who knows it intimately could use it without hesitation. Poirot said, only someone who trusts it to remain silent. Poirot's eyes locked onto Valois, and only someone who maintains that silence would return later. Valois' jaw tightened. The return that gave him away. Poirot raised one finger. You returned after the murder, Valois scoffed. You cannot prove that. Poirot nodded. Indeed, Poirot said softly. That is why I invited you all here. Poirot gestured to a crate near the passage. Inspector Japp, Poirot said. Would you please move that crate? Japp did so. Behind it, faint marks were visible on the stone floor, recent scuffs where dust had been disturbed and then brushed away. These marks, Poirot said, were made after the murder. Valois' lantern shook slightly. Poirot continued. Someone came back, Poirot said calmly, to ensure the passage remained concealed. Poirot smiled faintly. Lucien feared the cellar, Poirot said. Henri Valois corrected it. Pressure, without accusation. Poirot did not raise his voice. He did not accuse directly. He simply continued. You knew Marcel Duval would go to the cellar alone, Poirot said. You knew which bottle would provoke recognition. You knew which door would not speak. Poirot stepped closer. And you knew, Poirot added softly, that no one would question you here. Valois' composure cracked, just enough to be seen. You are weaving stories, Valois snapped. Poirot nodded politely. Then, allow me to finish the pattern. To the test of ownership, Poirot turned suddenly to the service passage door. Monsieur Valois, Poirot said, would you mind opening that door for us? Valois froze. Why should I? Poirot smiled. Because, Poirot said gently, you know how. Silence pressed heavily. Slowly, Valois stepped forward. His hand moved instinctively, not searching, not testing, but directly to the latch. The door opened without sound. Poirot's eyes softened. Merci, he said quietly. Valois realized his mistake too late. The cellar chooses. Poirot straightened. You see, Poirot said calmly, addressing the group, the cellar responds to those it recognizes. Poirot turned back to Valois. You never asked where the passage was, Poirot said. You never hesitated. Poirot paused. And when order was threatened, you returned. Valois' face had gone pale. Inspector Japp stepped forward. "Monsieur Valois," Japp said firmly, "I must ask you to come with me." Valois laughed bitterly. "On speculation," Poirot replied softly. "On behavior." Valois looked around the cellar one last time. "All this," he said quietly, "because I understood how it worked." Poirot nodded. "Yes," Poirot said, "and because you believed silence belonged to you." Not yet. The Valois was led toward the stairs, but Poirot raised a hand. "Not yet," Poirot said gently. Poirot turned back to the cellar. "This place has spoken," Poirot said calmly, "but one thing remains unsaid." He looked at Valois. "Why?" Poirot asked softly. "Did you return twice?" Valois said nothing, but his silence, for the first time, did not protect him. The cellar had finished obeying. Chapter 8. The mind that refused to be cornered. Henri Valois had always believed that intelligence was protection. It was not arrogance exactly, more a deeply ingrained certainty. In his world, clever men did not fall into traps. They designed them. And as Inspector Japp paused at the foot of the cellar stairs, waiting for formal instructions, Valois still believed the situation could be managed. He stood very still beneath the stone arch, lantern light cutting sharp angles across his face. His posture remained composed, but something subtler had changed. For the first time since Marcel Duval's death, Henri Valois was no longer certain where he stood. Hercule Poirot observed this with quiet precision. "Monsieur Valois," Poirot said gently, "please remain with us a little longer." Valois gave a thin smile. "I've nowhere to go, it seems." Poirot nodded. "Exactly." Pressure without force. The others were dismissed, not dramatically, not urgently. Poirot allowed the cellar to empty slowly, one uneasy figure at a time. Lucien Moreau left with visible relief. Isabelle Fournier avoided Valois' gaze entirely. Etienne Laurent lingered for a moment, then departed, shoulders heavy with dawning comprehension. Soon, only three remained: Poirot, Inspector Japp, Henri Valois. The cellar seemed larger now, emptier, colder. "Inspector," Poirot said quietly, "we will speak informally for the moment." Japp nodded and stepped back, allowing Poirot to take the lead. Valois exhaled slowly. "You've made your point theatrically." Poirot smiled faintly. "I dislike theatre, monsieur. I prefer clarity." Valois laughed softly. "You have behavior, habits, inference." Poirot inclined his head. "Yes." Valois' eyes sharpened. "But no confession." Poirot nodded again. "Not yet." The second return, Poirot turned and walked slowly toward the service passage. "You returned after the murder," Poirot said calmly. Valois scoffed. "You've said that," Poirot continued walking. "And you returned again," Poirot added. Valois stiffened. Poirot stopped near the concealed alcove. "The first return," Poirot said, "was to ensure silence." Poirot turned. "The second," he continued softly, "was to check something had not changed." Valois folded his arms. "Speculation." Poirot smiled. "Then tell me," Poirot said gently, "why you came back the next morning." Valois' jaw tightened. "I had business," he said sharply. Poirot nodded. "You always do." Poirot stepped closer. "But this time," Poirot said, "your business was fear." The thing that went wrong. Poirot knelt and brushed away a faint line of dust near the base of the rack. "Here," Poirot said softly. "This mark was made after the murder and after the cleaning." Japp leaned in. "Someone disturbed it again." Poirot nodded. "You returned," Poirot said to Valois, "because something troubled you." Valois looked away. Poirot pressed gently. "You feared," Poirot said, "that someone else had entered the cellar." Silence. Poirot straightened. "And you feared this," Poirot continued, "because there was something you had not removed." Valois' breath quickened. Poirot gestured toward the rack. "The cork," Poirot said quietly. Japp looked up sharply. "The cork?" Poirot nodded. "When the bottle shattered," Poirot explained, "the cork did not remain with it." Poirot's eyes never left Valois. "You kept it," Valois laughed harshly. "That proves nothing." Poirot nodded calmly. "No," Poirot said, "but keeping it proves intent." Why the cork matters, Poirot turned to Inspector Japp. The cork, Poirot said, bears Marcel Duval's initials. Japp inhaled. He marked rejected bottles. Poirot nodded. Monsieur Valois struck Marcel, Poirot continued, with the very bottle that symbolized his rejection. Poirot paused. And he kept the cork, not as evidence, but as vindication, Valois snapped. You're psychoanalyzing, Poirot replied softly. Yes. A mind that will not yield, Valois began to pace. He humiliated me, Valois said bitterly. He blocked my deals. He treated me like a servant in a place I built business in. Poirot listened. I deserved influence here, Valois continued. I earned it. Poirot nodded slowly. And when Marcel Duval refused, Poirot said, you corrected him. Valois stopped pacing. I never planned to kill him, Valois said quietly. I meant to frighten him, to remind him of consequences. Poirot's voice was calm. Fear, Poirot said, is rarely obedient. Valois laughed hollowly. The bottle slipped. Poirot shook his head gently. No, Poirot said, it did not. For the illusion of control, Poirot stepped closer, his voice lowering. You believe, Poirot said, that because you understand systems, you are beyond them. Poirot gestured toward the cellar. You believed this place would protect you. Valois looked around wildly. I made sure it stayed silent, he snapped. Poirot nodded. Yes, Poirot said, and that is why it condemns you. The final fracture, Inspector Japp stepped forward. Monsieur Valois, he said firmly, we have enough to hold you. Valois looked between them. You don't understand, Valois said desperately. If I hadn't acted, the estate would have stagnated, Poirot replied softly. You acted, Poirot said, because you could not accept refusal. Valois' shoulders slumped. Not fully, not yet, but the fight had gone out of him. Poirot straightened. One final gathering remains, Poirot said calmly. Valois looked up sharply. Another? Poirot nodded. Yes, Poirot said. Because truth must be spoken, not extracted. Valois closed his eyes. For the first time, the cellar did not obey him. Chapter 9. The silence that could no longer protect him. Morning entered the wine cellar without ceremony. No lanterns were required this time. Sunlight filtered faintly through the narrow ventilation grates, casting pale bands across the stone floor. The cellar looked smaller in daylight, less mysterious, less forgiving. What had once felt like a sanctuary of shadow now appeared exposed, ordinary and unforgiving. Henri Valois noticed this immediately. He stood near the central rack, hands clasped tightly behind his back, his confidence reduced to posture alone. The others gathered slowly. Etienne Laurent, Madame Laurent, Isabelle Fournier, Lucien Moreau, and two uniformed officers who waited quietly near the stairs. Inspector Japp stood beside Poirot. This time no one pretended it was a discussion. This was an ending. Truth does not need darkness, mesdames et messieurs, Poirot began calmly. Yesterday we allowed the cellar to demonstrate the truth. Poirot gestured gently around them. Today, he continued, we allow it to be spoken. No one interrupted. Poirot turned first to Etienne Laurent. You own Chateau Montreval, Poirot said. But ownership does not always equal authority. Laurent nodded slowly. Poirot turned next to Lucien. You feared the cellar, Poirot said gently, because it was no longer yours. Lucien swallowed but said nothing. Poirot then turned deliberately, unmistakably to Henri Valois. And you, Poirot said softly, believed it belonged to you. Valois exhaled sharply. I managed business here for years. Poirot nodded. You managed influence. Reconstructing the moment, Poirot walked to the precise spot where Marcel Duval had fallen. Marcel Duval entered the cellar alone, Poirot said. He expected inspection, discussion, control. Poirot paused. He did not expect correction. Poirot turned slightly. You were already here, Poirot said to Valois. Waiting. Valois' jaw tightened. Poirot continued calmly. You approached him casually, you stood close, you spoke. Poirot lowered his voice. You mentioned the bottle. Valois laughed bitterly. You imagine conversations now? Poirot smiled faintly. No, Poirot said. I understand people. Poirot raised one finger. You chose a bottle Marcel Duval had personally rejected. Poirot raised a second. You struck once, cleanly, without warning. Poirot raised a third. And when he fell, you did not stay. Silence filled the cellar. The escape that wasn't flight, Poirot turned toward the staircase. You did not flee this way, Poirot said, then toward the service passage. You left through here. Poirot stepped closer. You walked, Poirot said softly. Because you were not afraid, Valois snapped. Anyone could have used that passage. Poirot nodded. Yes? Poirot stepped back. But only one man returned afterward, to ensure silence remained. Poirot gestured to the stone floor, the disturbed dust, the brushed scuffs, the second correction. Valois' shoulders slumped slightly. Poirot pressed on. And then, Poirot said, you returned again. Valois closed his eyes. Why, he came back. You returned the second time, Poirot said quietly, because something still belonged to you. Poirot reached into his pocket. He did not display the object immediately. You kept the cork, Poirot said. Murmurs rippled through the group. Poirot finally revealed it, a worn cork, initialed faintly. Marcel Duval's mark, Poirot said calmly. A symbol of rejection. Valois stared at it. You didn't keep it as evidence, Poirot continued. You kept it as proof that you had corrected him. Valois' voice cracked. He humiliated me. Poirot nodded. And humiliation, Poirot said softly, is the favorite motive of entitled men. For the confession without drama, Inspector Japp stepped forward. Monsieur Valois, he said firmly, do you wish to amend your statement? Valois looked around the cellar, the racks, the passage, the place that had once obeyed him. He laughed quietly. I thought silence would save me, Valois said. I thought no one would hear, Poirot replied gently. Silence always hears, he said. It simply waits, Valois straightened. Yes, he said quietly. I struck him. Gasps echoed softly. I didn't plan to kill him, Valois continued. I meant to frighten him, to remind him he wasn't untouchable. Poirot nodded. And when he fell, Poirot said, you chose escape over aid. Valois did not deny it. I walked out, Valois whispered, as I had always walked. Inspector Japp nodded to the officers. Henri Valois did not resist. What remains after truth? As Valois was led toward the stairs, he paused. All that silence, he murmured. For nothing, Poirot replied softly. For clarity. The officers escorted Valois upward. The cellar felt lighter, not relieved, but honest. Lucien exhaled shakily. Madame Laurent wiped her eyes. Etienne Laurent stared at the floor where Marcel Duval had died. Poirot remained still. One last look. When the others had gone, Poirot stood alone in the cellar. He listened. No expectation, no obedience, only stillness. Your work is finished, Poirot murmured. The silent wine cellar said nothing. It no longer needed to. Chapter 10. When silence finally let go, Chateau Montreval did not celebrate the truth. There were no raised voices, no dramatic proclamations, no sense of triumph lingering in the corridors after Henri Valois was taken away. Instead, the estate settled into something quieter and far more difficult to endure: adjustment. Truth, Hercule Poirot believed, was never loud in its aftermath. It merely rearranged lives. The morning after the confession, A pale sun rose over the vineyards, its light moving slowly across rows of vines that had witnessed decades of careful cultivation and unspoken compromise. Workers moved through the fields with renewed purpose, yet spoke little. The estate felt exposed, as though a roof had been removed from a long sealed room. Poirot stood near the cellar entrance, suitcase placed neatly at his side. He had returned there once more, not because anything remained unresolved, but because some places deserved acknowledgement before departure. A cellar without authority. The wine cellar greeted him as it always had, cool, orderly, patient. But something was missing, not the bottles, not the racks, not even the shadows. What was gone was expectation. The cellar no longer waited for instruction. It no longer responded to familiar footsteps or unquestioned confidence. It had returned to what it had always been meant to be, a place of preservation, not permission. Poirot walked slowly between the racks, hands clasped behind his back. "People believe silence is empty," Poirot murmured softly, "but silence remembers everything." He paused near the service passage. The door stood sealed now, marked for removal. No crate concealed it. No dust had been artfully brushed to disguise recent movement. Nothing hid anymore. But the estate learns to speak. Etienne Laurent joined Poirot quietly, his face drawn but resolute. "We are restructuring," Laurent said. "Oversight, clear boundaries. No one man will ever move freely like that again." Poirot nodded approvingly. "Power," Poirot said gently, "must always know where it ends." Laurent sighed. Valois was never officially in charge, and yet everyone deferred to him. Poirot looked at him kindly. "Because authority," Poirot replied, "is most dangerous when it is unspoken." They stood together in silence for a moment. "And Marcel?" Laurent asked quietly. Poirot lowered his gaze. "Marcel Duval believed in rules," Poirot said. "He forgot that rules require courage to enforce." Laurent nodded slowly. Lucien Moreau's freedom. Lucien waited near the tasting room, his shoulders lighter than Poirot remembered them. "I thought I would never escape this place," Lucien admitted quietly. Poirot smiled faintly. "You never needed to escape." Lucien hesitated. "Why did he choose me to confess?" Poirot replied softly. "Because fear is obedient, and guilt is noisy." Lucien exhaled. "I won't let silence be used like that again." Poirot nodded. "Good. Silence should be chosen, not commanded." Isabelle Fournier's regret. Isabelle Fournier stood by the courtyard fountain, staring into water that reflected a sky far clearer than the days before. "I screamed," she said suddenly. "But I screamed too late," Poirot joined her. "You screamed when it was safe," Poirot said gently. She turned to him. "Does that make me complicit?" Poirot shook his head. "It makes you human," he replied. "Bravery rarely arrives on time." Understanding the killer as Poirot prepared to leave, Inspector Japp walked beside him toward the waiting car. "Valois still insists he didn't mean to kill," Japp said. Poirot nodded. "He is telling the truth." Japp frowned. "Then why—" Poirot stopped. "Because," Poirot said quietly, "he believed control was consequence-free." Poirot continued walking. "Men like Valois do not see murder as violence," Poirot said. "They see it as correction." Japp exhaled slowly. "That's worse." Poirot smiled faintly. "Much." The final visit before departing, Poirot returned alone to the cellar for the final time. He stood where Marcel Duval had fallen. There was no mark, no stain, no visible memory. Yet Poirot bowed his head slightly. "Order without conscience," Poirot murmured, "is merely cruelty in good lighting." He turned toward the door. The hinges remained silent. For the first time, that silence felt honest. Leaving Montreval, the car rolled slowly down the gravel drive, Chateau Montreval receding into morning light. Poirot watched until it disappeared from view. Another estate corrected, another illusion dismantled, another silence taught to speak. Poirot closed his eyes. The most dangerous killers, he reflected, are not those who flee, but those who believe they belong. And with that thought, he allowed the road ahead to claim his attention. The case was complete. The silence was free. End of story. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of this mystery. If this story held your attention, share your thoughts in the comments. Was silence the greatest accomplice? Or was entitlement the true killer? If you enjoy long-form Hercule Poirot mysteries inspired by classic detective storytelling, remember to like the video and subscribe for more thoughtful, slow-burn investigations. Until our next case, remember, silence does not erase guilt. It only waits.